what I can say to you as someone who's survived 2 abusive relationships and also has worked across a variety of sectors responding to people who've experienced family violence is doing something is better than nothing. Showing you care, showing that you've noticed is better than doing nothing.
Welcome to yourbrilliance.com. I'm your host, Amy Waterman. If you're in an abusive relationship, the very last thing you want to do is to stay stuck in your home with your abuser for weeks and months on end, unable to get any help, unable to see any friends. But that is what's happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. Lockdown restrictions have had a significant impact on domestic and family violence. So what do we need to know about the effects of the pandemic on domestic abuse? And how can we get support to those who need it? Our guest for today is expertly positioned to answer those questions. Cathy Oddie is a family violence advocate, a public speaker, and a consultant. She's a victim representative with the Victims of Crime Consultative Committee in Victoria, Australia. Last year, she became the first official survivor ambassador for Metal Women. She is passionately committed to the healing, recovery, and financial well-being of victim survivors of domestic and family violence. Welcome, Cathy.
Hi, Amy. Thanks for having me.
So we got to start out with a big question then. How has the pandemic affected women and children stuck in difficult family situations?
Well, unfortunately, the pandemic has had an absolutely catastrophic impact for women and children. So in terms of domestic and family violence across the world, it already was something that was at, well, what we'd say here in Australia, at national emergency levels. And it's intensified that so much more. So what we do know is in times of crisis, such as when we see natural disasters such as tsunamis, bushfires, earthquakes, that levels of family violence will increase. However, in this situation that we're in right now, it's not like a bushfire, which is a time limited period. It's, as we all know, this pandemic is ongoing. We don't know when the end will occur. So for women and children in particular, though, let's acknowledge that also men can be victims of abuse, that it's a situation where it gives perpetrators so much more opportunity to control and isolate their victims, because in a sense it's state sanctioned. For particularly like most countries in the world had a period where there was lockdown and quarantine. There are still countries such as here in Australia that we're going through that, like here in Victoria, we're probably going through one of the strictest quarantines in the world, where there's curfews at 8 p.m. at night, where people are only able to exercise for an hour a day and are not able to travel more than 5 kilometres outside of the radius of their home. So if you think of that in the context of family violence and how that can impact the ability of those who are going through a situation of abuse to access help, you can imagine it just makes things so much more complicated.
Yeah. So is this just worsening existing abusive relationships, or is the stress of everything actually creating abuse in relationships that were just fine before?
It's a bit of both. So let's acknowledge the fact that COVID-19 is not the cause of family violence, as is not things such as drug and alcohol abuse or mental health issues. Family violence is a result of the perpetrator seeking to have control and power over their victims. The issue is, so in relationships where abuse already existed, what we're seeing in the sector is that the level and severity of abuse is being increased to a degree of severity that's a lot higher in terms of rates of homicide of women and children, the severity of injuries that are caused, and But on the other side, in relationships where maybe abuse hadn't been so much of a factor prior to the pandemic, we're now seeing that instances of abuse are starting to occur. So you have to see this as an absolute pressure cooker environment where all these additional stress factors which are impacting all of us, for those who are not coping and dealing with those stress factors in a healthy way and maintaining boundaries in the way that they treat their loved ones. Yeah, that's what we are actually seeing, abuse in places where abuse hasn't previously occurred.
So the abuse and that's been there before is getting so much worse. There's rates of homicide are going up. Like, what sorts of changes are you seeing in the patterns of domestic violence right now?
So I think this is something that we've seen reflected both here in Australia and also internationally, that when the pandemic first started to take hold, is that all the family violence and mental health services were poised and on edge for an absolute tsunami of calls and help seeking behaviours to commence quite early on. However, we didn't actually see that. And I think the key reason why that didn't happen sort of earlier on is because of the nature of how restricted lockdown was for a lot of people. And to be in an environment, if you can imagine, where your perpetrator is controlling every aspect of your life. And if you normally are someone who has the ability to get out and do your shopping, go to work, go to your children's school, all the various touch points where you normally have access to other people that you can talk to, those touch points for help have become very limited for a lot of people. And so just even being able to make a phone call to a helpline has been very difficult when you may be having someone controlling and over listening into everything that you're doing. So the other thing, I guess, what we're looking at is the fact that many people are working from home. And this is, I guess, a new part of abuse, is that normally when someone goes to their workplace, even though we do see many perpetrators who do seek to control their victims at their work, but what we also see, that work is often an escape for the victim survivor. And in terms of the systems that they're using at work, if they're working a lot of IT systems, they can go there and the perpetrator doesn't have access to those work emails and all the things that are related to that. But now if people are working from home, it might actually be compromising the security of the work that they're actually involved with. And if they're in a Zoom meeting with their work colleagues, this is something that I'd be saying to people. If you're noticing that your colleague always seems to go quiet when their partner walks past them and they have a bit of a behavioural shift, that could be a warning sign.
So what are some more signs? Because I know for many of us, we want to help, and we look at some of the people in our lives, we wonder whether those relationships maybe have crossed a line, but we don't want to interfere and we don't want to suggest something if actually everything's okay. What are some other signs that we can look for to know if maybe there's someone in our life that does need help but can't ask for it?
So I think it's really looking at those shifts in behaviour. If you're noticing that your friend, your colleague, your family member is starting to withdraw and not behave in a way that is normal for them, if they're clearly distressed, if they're showing any signs of injuries, all of those things would be something that I would see as an opening to ask the question, really quite simply, of, are you okay? I've noticed this thing or that thing's happening for you, just wanted to check in. Also, really important too, is if you're suspecting there might be family violence, is to do a check-in to say, is this a good time to talk? Is this a safe time to talk? Because now that restrictions are lifting in a number of countries, it means that people can get out to places like supermarkets, for example, or go for their daily walk. And you could say, look, when you go and do your shopping, or when you go and do your exercise for the day, give me a call, or I can call you, and let's have a chat when you've got the space to speak freely alone. And I think that's where you'd be not needing, don't ever feel like you have to be the family violence expert, the social worker, the counsellor. That's not what's expected of people. It's showing some genuine human compassion and empathy. I always look at it like if someone you loved or that you worked with was expressing suicidal ideation, you wouldn't just do nothing about that. You would check in with that behaviour, and you would also offer them referral for support. Like here in Australia, the number that you would most often give would be for Lifeline. Obviously, in different countries, you'd have different contact numbers. So it's really, you don't have to know what your local support services are. Obviously, if you do, that's fantastic. But what I would always advise people is just to equip yourself with what is the national contact number. So here in Australia, we have a hotline called 1-800-RESPECT. Yet again, in different countries around the world, there is similar contact numbers. And the great thing about those national numbers is the people who answer those calls then have the ability to actually drill down and look at what the local services are. So I think a lot of people feel really overwhelmed when the topic of family violence comes into the picture, because they think, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to feel like I'm interfering or maybe causing additional risk for this person. But what I can say to you as someone who's survived 2 abusive relationships and also has worked across a variety of sectors responding to people who've experienced family violence is doing something is better than nothing. Showing you care, showing that you've noticed is better than doing nothing. And also something that I advise is a really helpful thing for people to do is if you're seeing a pattern of behaviours, so whether that's friend, family member, a neighbour, a colleague, one of your staff, is to keep some notes, because you have no idea how useful they could be to that person. Because when you're in the midst of the crisis and the abuse, you're just thinking about your daily survival. And also it may place you in danger actually keeping notes about what's going on. So if you're someone who's observing things over a period of time, and if you can just note dates and those things, that actually can form really key evidence at a later date for legal proceedings.
Oh, that's so important. There's so much. One of the difficulties, I think, is not only is it more difficult to be able to call a helpline, but right now, if somebody is stuck in an abusive relationship, it can be hard to see how they would get out, because family and friends who would normally just take you in are going to be really cautious. They might not even be able to take you in because of restrictions. Your partner is home maybe full time now because either he's unemployed or he's working from home. Kids that would have normally been at school may be doing an online curriculum now, and they're not going. And it can really seem like until lockdown restrictions ease, until life goes back to normal, that you've got to just stay stuck in the situation because there's nowhere to go. What would you tell somebody who's trying to figure out whether they can even afford to try and get out of the relationship right now?
Okay, well, that's actually one of the key concerns for all family violence survivors in a period of a pandemic or not. So having, as I said, worked in different sectors, particularly our government social security office, Centrelink, and in the finance sector, this was a question that came up over and over again, was I'm going through this abuse, I want to leave. However, how can I afford to leave? So what I would say is it's really, yet again, getting in touch with your National Family Violence Crisis Service, getting them to link you in with whatever the local services in your area are. They will help you to make a safety plan to leave, because it might be that you need to start looking at getting a separate bank account that the perpetrator doesn't have access to. I know here in Australia that banks can help create an online account that's not visible on your statements, so that if your perpetrator was to log into your accounts, they wouldn't see it. That type of thing. So there's a range of options that, yeah, financial institutions, government services, community sector organisations can do to support. Here in Victoria, we have something that's called the Family Violence Safety Package, which is around $10,000, which is a targeted package that can help victim survivors get into housing, get security put into their housing, help their kids relocate to different schools. So what I'd say is, and also having experienced how exhausting and complicated it can feel trying to navigate all these systems and services, is don't feel like you have to do that all yourself. Really put some trust in to some of these services who are the professionals. And number one thing is, don't feel like you're alone and that there is no help, because there actually is a lot of help out there. It's just making that first step to reach out and say, this is happening. What can you do to help me in this situation?
So that's a perfect lead into the work you do. You have such a vast knowledge of the support available in your area, and you do work as a family violence advocate. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So my family violence advocacy journey started in 2007 as a result of my lived experience of family violence. It's been, until recently, primarily a voluntary role that I've played that sort of ran a parallel alongside my paid positions, because I got to a point then where I was getting really angry and frustrated about how systems and services, how legal processes, how police and health sector were just not providing support and referrals in the way that they should for someone who's experiencing family violence. And I was continually looking at the fact that here was I, someone who at the point that I left my relationship was actually working for our key government social security agency. I'm providing assistance to people who are experiencing this, yet I'm finding it personally so difficult to get any assistance for myself. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm someone who's literate, I'm educated, I have knowledge of systems. And it started to really impact me, thinking, well, if I'm finding it so difficult, how much harder would it be for someone who is facing any number of other barriers in their lives, such as living with a disability or not speaking English as their first language? And this opportunity presented itself with the Victorian Family Violence Crisis Service called Safe Steps, where they started a project to train victim survivors to tell their story to media in a way that challenged victim blaming myths and gave us the ability to tell our stories in the way we wanted to have them told. And where it started as a media advocacy project, it's actually broadened so much further from that. So it's been advising on policy and legislation. It's been about helping in the creation of primary prevention resources. And my journey, I guess, in that has led on to a lot of media and speaking engagements. But one of the moments that has been sort of simultaneously the hardest and proudest of my life was participating in the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence. So I felt compelled to put in a submission in 2015, and I was then called to provide testimony. And as a result of my testimony, 2 of the final 227 recommendations were because of my evidence. And those 2 bits of recommendations really focus on the healing and recovery for victim survivors, and also the victims of crime assistance supports that you can receive. And it actually resulted in a complete review of the Victims of Crime Assistance Act. And I look at that and think, yes, it was so difficult to sit in front of this massive room of people sharing some of the most traumatic, hard moments of my life. But at the same time, the fact that it could result in such lasting change is something I'll forever be proud of. And it really has, I guess, stoked a fire under me to think, well, you know what? There's such power in working with the decision makers around policy. And I guess that's where my life has gone a bit more in that direction, to find how I can be involved in, for example, the Victims of Crime Consultative Committee. And yesterday I was just appointed to the Victoria Legal Aid Specialist Family Violence Court Steering Committee, to play that advisory role, to be the independent family violence lived experience consultant and ensure that that voice of lived experience is kept front and centre in any design of service delivery, legislation and policy.
Fantastic. Now, for those of you watching, if you want to learn more about Cathy's journey, about her advocacy work, about her speaking, then we have a link for you. Just go to yourbrilliance.org/Cathy. That's yourbrilliance.org/CATHY. Thank you so much, Cathy, for coming onto the show. And I wondered if you had any last message you would like to leave our viewers with.
My last message would be that if you are experiencing family violence, please reach out for help. If it means reaching out to one of your loved ones so that they can contact somewhere on your behalf, do that. If you're at immediate risk, contact your local police department. If you're not at immediate risk, you, as I said, should ring your National Family Violence Crisis number, and they will help you plan a safety plan to actually leave. And in terms of for people who are supporting someone who is going through this, know that, as I said, you don't have to be the expert. You just have to act with human compassion and empathy and think about what would you want if this was happening in your life. Don't be scared off by the term family violence. If this is someone experiencing a broken leg and you saw them in pain with that, you would ask them how they were. It's exactly the same thing that victims of family violence would like. Don't treat them as invisible, because it just compounds the isolation that they're already experiencing. So thank you very much for having me here today. It's been really fantastic. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cathy. And thank you out there for watching. Now, did you have any personal insights or aha moments while watching this interview? If so, share them with us in the comments. And for more interviews like these, make sure to subscribe to Your Brilliance TV here on YouTube, and then come on over to yourbrilliance.com for more tips and insights on how you can live your most brilliant life. See you next time.